So, hello. How are we this afternoon? Great. We're all thrilled to be here. I am Erica Green. I am a federal education policy reporter at the New York Times. And we'd like to thank you for joining us for our discussion today, exploring the lessons of BushObama school reform. As we all might know, we are here in the spirit of a new book co-authored by Rick Hess and Mike McShane, titled BushObama School Reform, and it was released yesterday. So we will have a panel today that will explore. Was it yesterday? Yes, it was yesterday. Okay, great. And we have a panel that will explore some of the themes of the book, but really looking at these two eras in which so much happened, and get folks' thoughts on what we can take from them as we enter a new era of school reform. A few housekeeping items. The event hashtag is BushObama School Reform. So if you'd like to tweet, feel free to do so. If you have any questions or comments, and for those of you watching online, we welcome your input as well. The event is being live streamed, and full video will be posted online when we conclude. And finally, please silence all cell phones, if you can, including you guys.
I will take your advice.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce who we have on our panel today. We have Mike McShane, the Director of National Research at EdChoice. He is also an adjunct fellow in education policy at AEI and a research fellow in the Economic and Policy Analysis Research Center at the University of Missouri. We have Bethany Little, who is principal at Education Council, where she supports foundations, associations, and nonprofits in improving education outcomes from early childhood to higher education. Previously, she served as education advisor to President Clinton and Vice President Gore on the Domestic Policy Council and at the U.S. Department of Education. Frederick Hess, a resident scholar and director of education policy here at AEI, where he works on K-12 and higher education issues. And finally, we have Darrell Bradford, who is the executive director at 50 CAN, where he trains and recruits local leaders across the country to be fellows and advocates for education. He also serves on the boards of organizations including Success Academy Charter Schools, EdBuild, and is it PIE? Do you just say PIE?
PIE, yes.
Okay, PIE. I was going to say PIE, but you know. So we'd like to welcome our panelists today, and we look forward to a very robust discussion. So I'd like to open and just cut right to it. I'd love for you all to tell us kind of where you were, what you were doing when you learned your first lesson of the Bush-Obama school reform era, when something clicked and you said, wow, this is something that we're really going to have to take with us into the next era and not do it again or try it again. And we can start with you.
Yeah, so I don't want to make anybody feel old, but when No Child Left Behind was passed, I was still in high school.
Yeah, you just made everybody feel old.
All right.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that.
Maybe getting a little bit closer. When Race to the Top, for example, I think that was announced in July of 2009. So I was actually just finishing up being a high school teacher and hadn't started graduate school yet. So a lot of these big debates at the beginning I was not a part of. And I think that shows. No, I'm kidding. No, but, I think back when actually at old AEI, that some of you might remember, that was just a couple blocks over, Rick and I did a book conference back, I think it was early 2013 or maybe late 2012, all about the Common Core. And this was like before the Common Core became the Common Core, right? This was back when it was still something that sort of education people were interested in. And we put together this, I think, a really great group of people to have a discussion about, hey, this thing called the Common Core is starting to get rolled out now. And there are some issues with it that we might want to talk about. And it was published by an academic press. It wasn't some really over-the-top criticism of it, but I thought people were raising some pretty legitimate, clear things about how the Common Core was going to intersect with some of the other education reform efforts that were afoot, how the governance of it was kind of questionable, and we didn't know what was going to roll out with that. And I think generally speaking, a lot of people that were involved in that process just had no interest in that. I think, I got the vibe from a lot of them that they were like too busy winning, right? Like all these states were passing stuff and all these things were happening. And so for us to be standing there saying like, well, but what about this? No, wasn't a lot of interest in that. It was more like the train is rolling down the tracks and you're either kind of on the train or you're throwing rocks at it or something, So that, like I said, coming late to the party, but just sort of noticing that kind of echo chamber that was created, or this kind of us versus them that showed up, where kind of reasonable or legitimate criticism was dismissed as kind of hating on something or sour grapes. I was like, as we talk about other sort of areas of public policy, that's not a recipe for success.
So I think inherent in the question is when was the lesson you learned that was it's an overreach or it's a challenge? I have those, but I'm actually going to start with the first moment when I really did learn a lesson from the reforms, which was after we passed the No Child Left Behind Act. I went on what I call the mediocre sandwich tour, because I was invited to lunch at every place in America because nobody knew what was in the 1,000-page bill. So the few of us who'd actually sat at the table and wrote it were in high demand because no one wanted to read the thing. So they just wanted me to come for lunch and tell whoever they could get in the room. And that ranged from organizations like this one to going across the country to Washington State. I was working for Patty Murray at the time and going all over Washington State telling every PTA what was in the bill. So on the mediocre sandwich tour, I was trying to explain to people over and over again what was potentially possible in the bill if you brought capacity and expectations together in new ways. And it was a moment where you realized that there was potential. There was something there that could shift the way people behaved. And about a year later, a woman that I'd seen out in Washington State, a teacher on my mediocre sandwich tour, came in to visit in our DC office and said to me, this thing is such a mess. It is creating so many problems for us. Everybody's really questioning how they're going to achieve what you expect of us. But we are paying attention to our special ed kids like we never have before. And at that moment, I realized a really important thing about the reform years, which is they impact real kids, and they're on the other end of the reforms, and you got to keep that in mind. I got other ones too, but I'll start with that.
That's good. Well, first off, I want everybody to know that the creative title of this book, Bush-Obama School Reform Lessons Learned, totally got to credit Mike McShane.
Oh, thank you.
Well played.
Thank you.
He's got to get it. The first time I think, and I didn't realize it at the time, it's one of those lessons that only became really clear 10 years later, because I think very slowly. But back, it was late 2002, shortly after I had left University of Virginia to come to AEI. Got a call from the Pentagon. This story is in Letters to a Young Ed Reformer, so apologies to those of you who've heard me tell this one. But I get a call. They want me to go to the Pentagon. I have to agree to a non-disclosure to go over. I'm like, sure, I'm there. So we're at a meeting, and it turns out they've started preliminary planning for occupation of Iraq after an invasion, and they're putting together teams to oversee the ministries, and they're wondering if I'd be part of the education ministry oversight team. And so there were a couple of meetings when I wound up opting out. That's a whole other conversation. But at one point during this, a very nice young woman from the White House was in the briefing with us, about 4 of us, several from the Pentagon, a couple of folks from the White House. And she said, I just want to make sure everybody understands that one thing the president is just passionate about is making sure that when we leave Iraq, we leave them with something like No Child Left Behind for their children. And in retrospect, it just became blindingly clear as we went through kind of brand name, capital letter reform over the last 15 years, with the race to the tops and the Common Cores and the widget effects, and the degree to which when we see an opportunity and we're passionate about it, the degree to which whatever hammer we're swimming in suddenly makes everything in the world look like a nail. And to me, so many of I think when I think back on that moment, so many of the well-meaning missteps that followed, I should have seen coming if I'd actually understood what was going on in that room.
So I'd like to thank the American Enterprise Institute for inviting me to a panel that's basically four smart people in Durrell. If it was anyplace else, I wouldn't be here because Tottenham's on. So I just wanted to too. So two things really. Unlike most of the other folks here, so I work in advocacy, and I was like working in another world before I started working on education policy. So when I collide with No Child Left Behind, it is as a person whose only experience in education was my own, right? And so I'm sort of like learning things about myself while I'm learning about how the world is built and what the incentives are and whatever. The first thing I would say is that you have no idea how powerful it was in like year 2 to roll out the AYP list and what that meant, right? Like, so all of a sudden you're making grassroots level comparisons between schools and systems and like schools within cities. Like I had an office in Newark. I had one in Camden at the time. Camden is also a place in New Jersey. It's not only in England, if anybody's confused about that. The conversations you would have with parents were like electric, and the demands they were willing to make after that information was introduced into the universe were transformative, right? So I remember that happening and conversations having with my boss and everybody. And the downside of that was what happens when a ritzy suburban district that wants to sort of like homogenize away the 10 black kids that aren't doing well has to use that subgroup, and that means the school doesn't meet AYP. Like, what happens on that, right? So you step into this whole political mess, which for me was like very new at the time, but still very powerful. The other side of that is the conversation I had, I don't know, like this is like 8 years in, so I'm on the Obama side of the continuum at this point. And I was at this bar, as I often am, and a friend of mine who works in ed policy, she's real smart, way smarter than I am, and she's explaining to me the trickle-down effect of the waivers and how it's all going to end, in Jersey at least, with 80,000 happy teachers pleased about the fact that we're going to evaluate performance based on test scores and like the sigma. And I was like, what? Like, huh? Like, where did this come from? I think at the time I had like a little, I totally think effective teaching matters. I think we have to figure out a way to measure it well. I'm not advocating that, but I do think there was something inside of me that was just like, I don't know if this is exactly what we were doing before. Like, this feels like a different thing. This feels like a different request of people, of parents, like of constituencies, because teacher effectiveness isn't really like a grassroots constituency unless you're opposing it, in which case it's very grassroots. And then I was like, yeah, we're just in a different place now. So it was an interesting, continuum. It didn't happen all at once, but the place we landed in was unexpected and in many, respects sort of unfortunate.
Okay, so, I'm a reporter. So kind of a question that I had, especially going through the history that's so well laid out in the book of education policy, is why the Obama-Bush eras were so formative, why they were so politically charged. Because what struck me is, some of what we saw was really kind of reinventing the wheel, based on what I had read and I did not know about before I had read the book. But, the Improving America's Schools Act, you saw elements of decades worth of policy, yet these two eras are the ones that get people so riled up and were pretty formative in terms of what reform looks like. Can you guys just weigh in on that?
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point. You're right. So, the Improving America's Schools Act, people need to remember that in 1994, President Clinton pushed for this radical test-based remaking of American ed. He wanted schools in the 94 reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to have to test in reading and math once in elementary school, once in middle school, and once in high school, with no consequences. He just wanted the states to have to test once at each level and then make this information available to parents. And he got lit up by the ed schools and the teachers' unions and they all said he was a testing maniac. And so what happened was that stuff wasn't in the 94 ESEA, and instead they passed a companion bill, the Improving America's Schools Act, And where states got money, if they agreed to do this, all the states took the money. Only about 1/5 of the states actually did what they promised to do. So partly what happened was, what's interesting is the federal role really from the Carter, the creation of the Department of Ed under Carter until 2000, you did indeed see these kinds of efforts in Washington. The governor's meeting under Bush 41, Clinton's push in 94. But most of this stuff didn't have any teeth. And so it was a little bit of money and a lot of happy talk. And I think what really changed, starting with NCLB and then Race to the Top, was the sticks and the carrots made this stuff, for good and bad, just much more real in the lives of educators and communities. And that's, I think, why suddenly this stuff feels different than all those earlier efforts.
I mean, you helped write it. Do you want to?
Yeah.
I was
Bethany, I'm particularly
exactly
interested in
where Rick went. I actually do think, look, education is a system. It's a deeply entrenched human bureaucratic system. And if you push a system, it'll push back. It's built for survival. It's built to outlast anything that wants to destroy the system. And what happened was federal law started actually going after change in the system and expecting things to be different than they were, and not just funding it to be bigger, but actually wanting it to change. And the system pushed back with all of its might, and it came from both ends politically to meet us in the middle in ESSA. Mm-hmm. There's that.
Can I jump on that? I'm glad you said the four-letter word, politics. I do think that, so I used to say, kind of tongue-in-cheek but real, that Barack Obama's education reform was George Bush's education reform with a much more charismatic messenger. And I think, so the effects of the political personalities of the two people who did those things were also compromised or sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? So you have the Iraq War, right? And then you have healthcare reform. And those two things polarize the political worlds against anything that either President Bush or President Obama wanted to do. And so everything feels the sort of sclerosis of that, kind of downstream. There's one other thing I want to say that I think is important, and Erica touched on it, and I love Rick's history lesson. In 1994, I was a college student, so again, only caring about my own education. But in this book, Tinkering Toward Utopia, which I've read like the first 50 pages of and keep wanting to claw my eyes out because it's like a slow, awful read. They put forth the premise, is a really good one, which is that sort of reform is a constant state. It's just the political context vacillates. So you get, like Sputnik, like the race that, like Russian, the space war, right, is global competition, in the late 90s, right? Like, and over time, you get the same sort of historical cycles because we're who we are, right? And the institutions are always kind of responding to them one way or another. So I do think it's important to know that that Bush and Obama, that's actually what Clinton did. That's, which was sort of what FDR did. There's a longer thread being pulled through history there.
Do you want to add anything?
Oh, great.
Okay. So kind of building on the political beast that goes into ed reform, I wanted to ask you guys, in both instances, Race to the Top and NCLB, it seemed like everyone was on the train and the tour and even international diplomacy, I guess. And there tends to be, a wide range of bipartisan support at the beginning. And we saw that with ESSA. And now I see that folks who wrote it together are at each other's throat, right? So I was wondering if you guys could talk about what happens after it's signed and everyone goes away for winter break and then they come back. Where does it sour?
Well, I think it all is based in ideas that have a broad appeal. I mean, if you look at polling data, even from the times like before No Child Left Behind and others, a lot of this, the fundamental components of it are popular. People even said back, pre-Common Core, like they liked national standards and they liked assessments and they think people should be held accountable for them. But when they become real and actual people's jobs are on the lines or actual schools are the things that we're talking about, all of that sort of happy talk, I think, falls apart. So I think it's this mishmash of the idealistic version of those things and when they're actually made concrete.
Just, to piggyback on that, two other points. One, Andy Rudalevich wrote a terrific chapter for a book Andrew Kelly and I did years ago, where he talked about how one of the problems is that really good politics tends to make for bad policy. That you think about the masters of the Senate, the people who are great at building these broad coalitions, you do that because everybody can go home and explain to their constituents how this bill speaks to them. And the problem is then when you have to get all these executive decisions made about implementation, somebody realizes that they got lied to. and so somebody's always unhappy. So one of the funny things is the better you are at getting 400 votes for one of these bills, the more likely it is that a whole bunch of congressional districts are going to say, we got sold a bill of goods. And that's just a reality, especially, and people might not always realize that in something like, agriculture. The farmers will know it, but none of the rest of us are paying attention. But on education, somebody's always going to see how this plays out. The other thing is, I think, building on Mike's point, is also how personal this gets. The education people in education don't tend to think of themselves like people do, say, in a lot of commercial interests around debates around subsidies, where people kind of see themselves as on one side or another of economic disputes. In education, everybody really thinks that they're there for the kids. And so one of the things that I just noticed with the Bush team and then again with the Obama team was I remember at somewhere we were at a dinner on one of these issues in the summer of 2009, and a good friend who I'd known for years was up, and he was in my face, Rick, who the hell are you to give Joanne Weiss such a hard time? We have a window here. She's killing herself to do the right thing. And it was really personal in the sense that it wasn't just that these were reasonable debates about how to do education, but these were people who were giving their hearts to something, and why would you be stabbing the team in the back? And I think that just adds a layer of harshness to efforts to try to disagree in constructive and meaningful ways.
Okay, I'll move on. So can you guys weigh in on what we've learned, from the stick and the carrot, right? And this, this spans kind of some of the main buckets of reform that we saw come out of the policies under these two administrations, from school turnaround to teacher quality, accountability. I'd like you to weigh on both, if you can, on the lessons that we learned from using the stick and the carrot.
There's no carrot big enough, and all sticks are too large. Right? I mean, like, if you have this, I'm not saying I agree with that. I didn't say I would agree with that. No, but that's the deal, right? So consider that, like, when Race to the Top happened, it was like $4.5 billion or whatever. We had all these people jumping through enormous hoops, right? I think it was like $400 million in Jersey. I don't know how much it was in New York. And some really good things happened about that. But for me, I was always like, $400 million on $21 billion, something like that, if you take all the revenue sources. And I'm like, this is pennies. Like, why are all these people doing these things for pennies, right? Which on the one hand speaks to how overheated and largely unsustainable school finance mechanisms are, right? So I just want to throw that out there. So that was a carrot that to a taxpayer looked like a huge one, but to the edifice that Bethany talked about was infinitesimal. On the other side, if I had this up on a wall, I would throw darts on it. It would, it's the whole test and punish mantra, because somehow knowing what was going on was punishment, right? It's just there was a devolution of the entire debate about improvement that meant the results, like the information was the bad guy, And I always say this, when you get your credit card bill, if you're spent out, the mailman is not the bad guy. He's just the messenger, right? He just comes and he's like, here you go, buddy, you got to do something about this. And I do feel like Rick's point is really right on. education is about the formation of the most important thing possible, like the human soul, right? So, and it's the one thing that nobody can ever take away from you, which is why it is so critical, right? Which is why it's so foundational. And the process of helping somebody get it is deeply personal in the best instances. It's also deeply personal in the worst. And so you could go to places that were really high performing, and people would be like, I get this, you know? And you go to places that were really awful, and they'd be like, this is like me waking up feeling awful and not wanting the diagnosis, you know? And I don't know how any public policy predicts that at the scale of 3.5 million teachers plus opt-out, plus people who like awful schools because they played football there, plus all kinds of other human motivations that attach people to institutions that underperform, but that they feel good about. And I just think the whole 8-year span of that, plus bits and pieces and now, just lay that really bare. And I think you have to make different decisions about how you want to have better schools or better opportunities if you acknowledge that that history actually happened.
I just add, I think the carrots and sticks are really on a continuum here, right? Like the truth is, the sticks were not
that big.
Sticky. Like there was nobody who got beaten, and there was nothing that got actually like closed. There was nothing. Nobody lost money. Like a lot of these things didn't actually happen. There was this mythology around what was actually going on in terms of the sticks. And to your point around the carrots, I mean, a ton of it wasn't enough money, but a ton of it was the over response to the carrot. Where and so one of the things that this is related, but I've really come to reflect on, and reading the book reminded me of this, is it's a very challenging mechanism to work with federal policy, because the leverage that you have is both narrow, rare, often weak. Like what you're pushing on to try to change the system doesn't really penetrate into the level of the system you're trying to change, and yet overly powerful in every possible way. When you push on it just like a tiny bit, the whole system overreacts to it. And so you have to be realistic about it. Those carrots and sticks at the federal level are a tricky thing to work with.
And part of this, too, is when we talk about this, we talk about it in terms that are convenient for us. So if you're doing it, if you're health staff, on the higher ed debates right now, it's about financing mechanisms. It's just, but like what's easy to overlook, except when it's convenient, is a lot of race to the top's power was all the media adoration. It was all the quotes. It was all the, oh, isn't this cool?
Great acronym.
And
RTTT.
And all this stuff, because I remember getting called by like state board members back then, and they were like, well, we've got to really apply how much, and it's not only $400 million, it was $400 million over 4 years. So it winds up being like when, Rick Perry wound up not applying, they were like, well, wait a minute, this is enough to operate our schools for a day. Right. And so there's that piece, but there's the media piece, there's the national conferences, there's all the consultants who are telling what to do, there's the funders who are giving discretionary money and making you a star, which is maybe not a big deal for the district, but great for your career. And so there's all of these interlocking mechanisms that flow along with it. So even if the levers themselves are more fragile than we'd wish, all this other stuff tends to encourage this kind of antibody formation.
Oh, I remember. Yeah, for principals in Baltimore City, AYP was the only thing that mattered. It was, it's the acronym that mattered more than what went at the end of their names. Really, it was everything. And for a race to the top, just think about the title, right? It was named that for a reason, I'm sure. And it was all, our state could talk about. And when we received it, it's my state is Maryland. It was a party. It really was. So anyway, I'm sorry, but your stick and carrot, you have nothing on sticks and carrots?
How do I follow that? No. You know what I was thinking of actually when they said that was I was listening to a podcast yesterday about technologies, and there's some law whose name is escaping me that all technologies, the impact of technologies are overestimated in the short run and underestimated in the long run. And sometimes when I think about a lot of these things, I think of the same thing, that we drastically overestimate what's happening in the short term in front of us, and then we forget about these long-term effects that change, like the people who taught in schools where AYP was everything. Even when AYP goes away, that effect doesn't. And so I don't think we often think about that. But the same thing is true that in the short run, it's like, well, AYP doesn't actually the carrots aren't happening. So it was overestimated in the short run, but underestimated in the long run.
So yesterday I watched a panel, or a hearing, should I say, on ESSA implementation. And
Fascinating nightlife you have.
I know. I do what I can. And Senator Lamar Alexander, said very pointedly and truthfully that ESSA implementation is at a tipping point, and I was interested to hear from you guys what lessons we take from the Bush-Obama era that we can apply to ESSA implementation, because there are no sticks or carrots, right? There's just the wide terrain, and everyone's going to do their thing, which is frankly, generating some controversy and even among the Congress leaders who very much believed in this law when it was reauthorized. So I was hoping that you each could talk about what lessons we could apply for the next 10 years. Okay, fine. The first year. Let's just deal with the first year.
I'll be very brief in the hand that one of the things that I think we have to take away from this time period is the idea that blaming implementation is not a magic eraser that takes every bad idea away. I think that if ideas can't be implemented, that's a problem with the idea. It's but I think so many policies, and this was done at the state level and others, if you talk to people now about whatever, they'll say the idea was great, but the implementation, the implementation. And I'm like, maybe it was a bad idea. Or maybe you didn't think through the implementation of it, and that's why it failed. So I hope that the takeaway isn't sort of whatever this thing I like is great, but then when it was sort of handed down to the little people, they're the ones that screwed it up. Because I think that's something that I think was learned before even the Bush-Obama years and through the Bush-Obama years as well.
So I'll just say two quick things. One is, I hope one of the things that we take into and through ESSA implementation is that whatever the idea is, the change is deep and long and will take capacity. And we've gone after federal change in education without capacity for a very long time. I don't think that's very functional. Sorry, I think I'm messing up my microphone. I don't think that's very functional. So I hope that one thing that people take into ESSA implementation is how to think about the role of capacity in making those policies functional at every level. So whether you're making a state decision or a district decision, understanding when you're making an ESSA-related decision, do we have the capacity to carry this through? It's related to your implementation point. And otherwise, thinking about maybe going at it differently is one thing. The second thing I'd just quickly say is looking at this next phase under ESSA, we often talk in trying to drive education systems change about the roles of leverage and leadership. And that ideally when you're trying to drive change, you have a balance of those things. You have some degree of leverage and some degree of leadership. But absent one, you really need the other. And so what we found in the Obama-Bush era was actually an overabundance of both. We had a lot of leverage. There were a ton of policies put on the table that people could use, whether it was the AYP at the school level or the RTT at the federal level. There was a ton that people could use to drive change. And there was a lot of leadership. There were a lot of people stepping up to say, I've got an idea. Let's do teacher eval, right? Everyone had their thing. And so I fear right now we have neither. I see neither leverage nor leadership in the ESSA era. And I know we've lost leverage. I don't see any way that comes back in the near future. There are some tails that people will try to maximize. I hope leadership finds its way to helping us make this not a net negative for students in the long run.
Leadership at the federal level or at the state level or the local level?
Yes.
All. All of the above.
Yeah. Wait, can I?
Yeah.
So I'm a little more circumspect about trying to answer this question right now, because I like science fiction. I like science. You wouldn't figure that out. Figure it out. I like video games too, but I like science fiction a lot because it describes a future we can't describe for ourselves, and it has science fiction has tremendous impact on the directionality of decision making. Right. So somebody, I don't know, was Dick Tracy DC? So somebody did Dick Tracy's watch. And then 80 years later, you got the Apple Watch, right? You can talk to your friends with it, right? You see people's faces on it, and movies and that kind of stuff. I think is really important. So like public policy can do that too. And I feel like, what we got from NCLB and then from Race to the Top was something that described a future that people felt like they could move toward. And that built like a momentum, if not a complete consensus, around the direction we should go in. And we totally don't have that now. It's like if what you believe is purposeful movement forward requires those elements, we have like a limbo thing. It's sort of a long is the way up time. And so, and I do not believe, given the current political environment, that we can like rationalize people around prescriptive end games anymore. And I'm very, like bullish is the wrong way to describe it, but what I feel very strongly and what I sort of get in my like political conversations and what I think I see from like parents all across the country is that we should focus on sort of condition setting. Instead of saying, this is the kind of charter school that is excellent, we should be like, chartering is a tool for creating things that are excellent. Let's see what you do with it. And that is like that's almost like the reverse of the prior 10 years, which had very specific things that we said, this is what we know works. We should try our best to do those things over again. And I just, like the ESSA might have been trying to get to that moment. And like the real answer is like, I don't work on ESSA at all. And almost no one I know who does ed advocacy does either. Because it feels like something, it's like, it returns so much control to everybody that there's no point of high leverage that makes it like maximally effective to work on it. So you work on charter policy because that's a point of high leverage, or you work on higher ed maybe, which might be like teacher training might be a point of high leverage too that isn't like circumscribed by ESSA. So I just think my lesson, like what I'm seeing in the States, is that like you got to let go actually, and focus on like dynamic playing fields where excellence can be created, instead of like very specific shoots of kinds of excellence that we know and find familiar.
I think that's really interesting. I like that. I don't think I agree. But that's really interesting.
It won't be the first time. Yeah.
I guess I would say two things. One, I think how you characterize ESSA depends on kind of the historical context. Because like if you think about it, I remember writing when like ESSA passed, that to my mind was kind of the long way round to 94. ESSA is a lot more than Bill Clinton and ed reformers would have thought they could have done in 94. Testing in grades 3 through 8, testing also in science, all of this, disaggregation, some of which is prescribed in ways that I'm not even sure is ultimately helpful. But I mean, this, to my mind, is not anybody do anything. The world post-ESSA assumes a baseline that is unimaginable in terms of how aggressively Washington is involved in setting out the frameworks for testing and reporting. Now, that might not be enough for people. That's totally reasonable to debate about. But anybody who sees post-ESSA is like back to a free-for-all is, I think, operating only with a post-NCLB kind of timeline. So I think that's just one thing that we should keep in mind. The big lesson for me in that ESSA world is one of the things that I think really struck Mike and I both in the book is how in both administrations, how frequently reforms are driven by political timelines rather than reasonable educational ones. So in NCLB, everything stalled out in summer of 2001. Then there was 9/11, and in the period of goodwill, they found a way to stitch together the stalled legislation, and they got it done by the end of the year. And in that, so everything that was still live kind of got pushed into NCLB because that was the last train leaving the station. If for people who know how Race to the Top got put together, everybody in the orbit of the folks at the department was throwing them their favorite idea. And that's how those 19 priorities got stitched together. And so I think what happens is when you see the train leading the station, it's the Rahm Emanuel line, a crisis is a terrible thing to go to waste. So all the ideas get jammed in, and they're like, let's do it. And so race to the top and waivers, we're going to do Common Core and new assessments and teacher evaluation in 4 years. And even if they were all good ideas, and I'm not stipulating they were all good ideas, but even if they were all good ideas, it's a crazy way to go about doing that in terms of things like capacity and implementation and getting people used to it. And so I think and this doesn't go away at the state level. Moving it from Washington to the states, governors also operate in a 4-year timeline. Governors also try to put together their big education package in year 1. And so as folks are operating in the ESSA world, these challenges between how do you operate in a political timeline that understands the realities of educational timelines doesn't go away. It just moves from Washington to the states.
So I'm interested to know whether you all believe that, the reforms, the trademark reforms of either one of these eras really move the needle for children. Because, I'm an education reporter.
That's what matters.
That's what matters. There's been, especially at the outset of the Trump administration, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not the stick and the carrot and the, whatever, actually worked. And that's really setting the stage for the new administration's, platform for what they think works. But I'd love to hear from you guys on whether or not, we've learned any lessons about what works, and if you've seen it anywhere.
I think it has moved the needle, but not perhaps in the way that was either intended or that a lot of people might take away from that. There are 2 great chapters. Well, they're all great chapters in the book. I should say they're all great chapters. There are 2 of particular note for this. Devin Carlson of the University of Oklahoma has a great chapter on accountability policy, and Matthew Kraft of an Ivy League school, Brown. I knew it was one of those schools that never would have let me in. But Brown has a great one on teacher quality policy. And one of the fascinating points that both of them sort of make in parallel to one another was that those reforms did not live up to their hype. I mean, obviously, no children were still left behind. And, there wasn't necessarily this great race to the top. But even though they didn't, they have left behind a lot of infrastructure that later folks are able to build with to do good things for kids. So while a lot of this sort of testing stuff and the cascade of remedies and whatever was a bit of a mess, the fact that we have this testing information, these other things, ironically, has actually helped us determine whether or not these other things worked. So we wouldn't actually be able to know that if we hadn't collected these things. I think a lot of the stuff around the teacher quality stuff as well, the actual evaluation reform didn't live up to it, but a lot of the new lines of research and the connections that are being made of understanding how teachers actually intersect with children, what they're doing, I think those things, again, over a longer term, have the opportunity to create a lot of good things for kids, but it's just not what we expected.
But did it create good things for kids?
Okay, can I be like a little, not namby-pamby? I can't remember what the word is I want to get. So I
can be whatever you want to be.
Cynical. This is the word. I was cynical. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm sure you'd never think I was cynical.
Whatever.
That's right. I feel like the more the reforms required the system to change, the less effective they were. The more they sidestepped the system, the more effective they were. So teacher quality required enormous buy-in, leadership, leverage, and the non-sabotage of every person being evaluated, right? Charter schools are like, we're doing our own thing, right? And so the path to whatever had less friction, And I'm not saying that every charter school is great or whatever. I am saying that, like, in terms of the ability to affect a kid's educational experience positively or negatively in a short time frame or a long time frame, the amount with which you had to fool with the system that has all this inertia, or coax different behavior out of it in a way that ultimately didn't revert back to the mean, had a big effect on whether or not you had a big effect. And I just, I spent a lot of time around charter school stuff. I care about school choice a lot. Like, we got, 15,000 kids, I think, at Success Academy now. Like, so many I can't count them all. and the results are crazy. And 13 years ago we had one school, and now we have like 47. Like we have so many I can't even count them. And while our mayor is like, he's always engaged in this zero-sum thing because he doesn't know how to make good new schools. So it's always about who he thinks should go to them. And on the other side, we're like, we'll make some more good ones, And like those were the dynamics I think that came out of this. Now, those dynamics are purposely divisive. Like I know a lot of people would like to, like bring charters and districts back, back together or together in a more broad way. I'm not like against that, but I just don't think that the more we lock the behavior of one set of reforms upon getting the other set of reforms to behave a certain way, the more we sort of set them both up for failure.
Well, Darrell, so, one way you just posited this was that the more you push the system, the more it pushes back. But Anna Galate in the book, for instance, argues actually that one of the reasons charters were so successful is because the charter coalition in New York looks nothing like the charter coalition in Arizona. So because it was never driven by Washington, their coalitions were able to be responsive to the context. They were able to build gradually without this sugar high of like 01 or 09. And so, so I'm just curious, how would you play it out? So if teacher evaluation post-widget effect was not suddenly identified where we're all speaking off the same slides assembled by New Teacher Project and then shared nationally by the US Department of Ed, but was actually done by state coalitions, do you think it would have still gotten the same pushback because you're trying to drive the system?
So you're asking two questions. They're both very good. The first one I would just say is that it's a mistake to assume that the New York coalition and the coalition in other states are on the same page too.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like
State
coalitions want different things because states are different. And then if you think about like charter policy as a whole, much like teacher evaluation or other kinds of policy, state context matters. So like Arizona's got some really good charter schools. There are a lot of people in the charter world that are like, we hate Arizona. I'm like, I like Arizona. Like Arizona's the best fit for Arizona. So I just want to like point that out.
Yeah.
Much like I think folks underestimated how much people like their own schools even when they're horrible. I think because it's like a value, not a policy thing. It's like a personal thing. I think people underestimated how much locality matters. And so, like, you could hash the worst idea locally, and it will be better received than the best idea hashed elsewhere. And I just don't, I don't think people, got that, right? Because you're like, this is the problem with having power. You come up with ideas and you do things, right? Because that's the way power works, So nobody wrongly behaved, right? And like everybody had like the best intentions. It's just like when it rolls downhill and it gets to, local, there are just tons more like there's history, there's emotion, there's a lot of emotion involved, and it can just blow up even the best idea or the best intention.
I have a question though. I have a follow-up question for you, Darrell. Do you believe that charters were able to flourish because they were not kind of beaten by the stick? Is that what you're saying?
So two things on this. One is I think not all charters flourish, right? So
no,
I want to make sure I like charter schools.
But the example that you gave.
Okay, yes. Yeah. So you can argue that the fact that charters are different than districts is a feature, not a defect of the model. And I would actually argue that because having an accountability framework that is timely, tenuous, and driven by choice is very different than having one that is elected school boards and all the other things that go into managing the performance of school districts. Mm-hmm. And under those two sets of rules, you get different things, right? So also, you can't hold New York up or like the greater metro region and say it's like every place else because like lots of people like to live in New York, right? Mm-hmm. Like New York is a great way to get talent that maybe the Delta doesn't or something like that. So there are other exogenous factors that certainly work on this. But to me, like we know what we can get if we regulate it the way we have normally regulated it, which is that you get lots of school systems that can be pretty good for white kids from two college-educated parent homes with a lot of money, with expensive housing, zoning, and everybody else, you kind of take your chances. Versus like, oh, under this other set of governance, we've seen different things happen for different kinds of kids that don't normally happen in that way. And I don't know if you want to call it a carrot or a stick, but I don't think you can ignore that the difference is actually a key factor in the result that you got in both of those instances.
Well, Erica, on your question of, so was this stuff good for kids?
Yes.
I think I would look. Depends how we gauge this, right? I mean, it seems that the kind of our default gauges are NAEP and high school graduation rates. NAEP showed some progress in the first decade after NCLB, though a lot of that bump was the 99 to 03, and which will always bedevil this conversation because NCLB didn't really start to get rolled out most optimistically to 02, realistically 03, 04. So a lot of that bump probably preceded the law. And we didn't see any gains in NAEP in any meaningful sense in the last decade, and that's pretty remarkable. We have seen a dramatic increase in high school graduation rates, but I'm actually real skeptical of those rates. I worry a lot about inflation and credit recovery, and so I'm not sure how seriously to take those numbers. And even on the story that NAEP tells, say in the years after NCLB, Dan Koretz has been writing about this, I think, masterfully for decades. Look, if scores are going up, but what that means is kids are spending more time on reading and math and less time learning other stuff, and more time reading and math learning skills that get tested rather than skills that aren't on the tests. That's not necessarily a terrible thing, but I wouldn't say that it's evidence that schools are getting better. It's just evidence that schools are teaching some stuff rather than other stuff. And that's not in any way, shape, or form what I think we're going for. So, I mean, the bottom line is even with the tools at our disposal, I'm real uncomfortable even saying confidently that students were better educated in 09 than they were in 01, or that they're better educated today in 18 than 01. I find it hard to argue that schools are worse for all this. These were efforts, there's more transparency. Mike talked about the scaffolding. Look, it's not unreasonable for people of goodwill to try, but I do think that what the downside of all that's happened is we've built a lot of kludge. We've imposed a lot of bureaucracy and built a lot of cynicism in communities and among educators. And I think the most troubling part of it is that we have really salted the earth around a lot of sensible concepts, which I think part of the appeal right now of social and emotional learning and career and technical ed and early childhood and free college is just that we haven't screwed these things up yet. And so if you're a governor or if you're Jeff Bezos, you run to that stuff because it's not been screwed up. But that seems to me actually a huge opportunity cost is I have been working at one of the things I've been trying to do is do my tiny little bit to contribute to efforts to give children better K-12 education for, the last 30 years since I started teaching, last 28 years since I started teaching. And the idea that this is now something we're hesitant to talk about in a polite company seems actually like a huge lost opportunity and a huge cost of the last 16 years.
Let me just add one other piece, which is I think that we have to recognize these as much longer-term undertakings than the hubris that we had going into them allowed us to realize they were. And I think that it's going to take much longer to see whether or not the system's actually going to change or if the system will prove stronger than any other vision for how we might do better for students in the country. But people in my circles these days, it's not particularly politic to say you're an ed reformer, but I would still say I'm an ed reformer. And I'm an ed reformer because I believe that the core of ed reform, everybody's like, what does being an ed reformer mean? Are you pro-charter? What's your bag? To me, being an ed reformer means that you put the achievement of students at the center of the system design, and everything you try to do keeps data and evidence and research about how to do it better so that the student succeeds at the center of it. Now, there's a bunch of stuff you could pack around that, but that's to me what it's about. And I actually think that was what brought so much political consensus into the BushObama era that people may not have seen from the outset, but was what made all of these reforms possible. There was a lot of consensus around these reforms, and it was that one, could we all get around that idea? And then how you do it, often look like your Christmas tree because everyone had to get their piece, but that was at the center of it. And I think that shift in mentality of how we think about and design the system may take root, may have taken root, in fact. And people say to me, ed reform's dead. And I say, no, I think people who are in ed reform have learned, matured, and are expanding their view of, okay, that was 1.0. We got one thing on the table. It was the fact that students are at the center of the system and their achievement matters, and it should not be dictated by their zip code or race or gender or anything else. And now we're learning more about actually to achieve that's going to require more than math and reading worksheets. It's going to require an equitable learning environment in which their identity is affirmed and they can enter into learning in a functional manner. There's 17 layers to this that I could go on about where I think most ed reformers are right now. And it's not because they've said those things didn't work. It's because they said, wow, there is so much more we need to and can bring to the table without losing this piece at the center of the student's success, and data and evidence and research about that is what's going to drive the way we iterate towards making it true, I think is a win.
Great. I ran a couple of these questions by a principal in Baltimore City in preparation for this panel, and I asked her, what she learned from each era, and for NCLB, she said she appreciated it because it showed just how hard the work is, and it forced her to pay attention to students that may have been invisible. For the Obama years, she says, you tell them that money does matter. Money does make a difference. And I asked the same question if it made any difference for schools. And she goes, well, we are an expletive, a lot more resilient. So I just thought I'd shed some light there. So we're going to move into our Q&A. We'd love to have some questions from the audience. And if you could just please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Hello, thank you all for speaking today. My name is Olivia Shaw. I'm from the University of Arizona. And so when we were talking about Arizona, I know exactly which charter schools you're talking about, Basis. We definitely know the legacy of Basis in Tucson.
I'm a Great Hearts fan, too.
Okay, thank you. Yes, of course. I was just wondering, for the center that I work for right now, the Center for Education Reform, I've had to look up governors who are running for office and where they stand on charter schools. And a lot of governors running for office have campaign points about adding mental health measures in their schools, which is something that I've never really seen before or even sort of heard come up. Do you think that they should remain local mental health measures or be risen to the federal level from your understanding of the Bush and Obama sort of eras? Or do you think that everything should remain local for education from now on?
I mean, that strikes me as a governor's response to Parkland, right?
Yeah,
They're looking at, what do I say to assure people in my state that I can keep them safe from somebody coming in with a gun? And they're going to mental health measures, which I'd rather they go to that than let's arm the teachers, but it seems more sane. but I don't think there's any serious, even understanding of what usable mental health measure in an ed system accountability context would look like, and how you'd possibly take that federal, but maybe you all see it differently.
No, not at all. I mean, I just think one of the lessons from the Bush-Obama years that I think we should take is that at each level of abstraction or at each sort of governmental level, a way that you get from the actual act, a child and a teacher, the tools that you have to measure that get blunter and blunter, right? So like I used to be a high school teacher, and so like my principal could come in and observe my teaching in all the nuances and all the everything that's going on and whatever. But then like, a superintendent is one step removed and can only look at a certain level of aggregation. When I think of something like mental health, which is so fine-grained and with each child, I just think the more levels of abstraction you get away, the more blunt and ridiculous the measures will be and the less useful they'll be.
Erica, there's an interesting point here that's not in the book, but some of our colleagues around here who do defense studies, armed forces and such, have explained to me at various points that one of the, when I ask, well, how does it work in the military when, the Pentagon says, man, we got to go in there and we got to, win this battle in this town, and we only want to send 25 troops. Like, is your job to say, well, we'll go do it? Or your job to say, that's crazy. I need 300 troops, or we shouldn't even talk about it. And they explained to me that like that what they're trained at on West Point and in any healthy and military culture is the folks at the bottom are supposed to push back. They're supposed to be like, that's an unreasonable request for our force footprint, and they're supposed to be, at the end of the day, orders go downhill. One of the things that's happened, and it's really been the good part of the post-NCLB years, is back in the 1990s, it was incredibly easy to find people who would blame kids or families or communities if kids weren't learning. It was just routine when you were in schools. And post-NCLB, that culture has shifted in profound ways, which is really good and healthy. But one of the unfortunate consequences is now when principals or teachers say, you want me to mental health screen every kid? It's going to be, that's going to be a half hour for each of 400 students in this elementary school. And people say that's making excuses. Just make it happen. So I think we've lost the ability, and part of this, part of the legacy of NCLB and then the enthusiasm race to the top and all that went with them, to have these constructive back and forth about what's reasonable and where should practical knowledge put limits on our big ideas. And I think one of the good things out of ESSA is if, as governors are saying that, if there is more openness to people in real schools saying, here's why we think that's a really bad idea, and if they're actually having useful back and forth rather than shouting these people down for not caring about kids.
Can I just one more thing on this? So I can remember back in the day when people were like, reading and math it's too much, right? And those are pretty like objective. Now it's like you want to measure school climate based on something as sort of like nuanced as the mental health status of like 100 kids or something like that. And so you can't like, the answer to 2 indicators can't be 30. And I do think right now we're struggling with ways to measure effectiveness of everything, right? And that, these guys know this, they still let me come around. I care about assessments, right? I think particularly if you're a black kid from Central Harlem who doesn't have a great social network and doesn't have a lot of people who are going to write letters and let people know that regardless of your GPA, you're brilliant, that objective measures matter, right? It's just like you take it in with you. Maybe it's just a special case, maybe it's a personal case, but I care about these things. That said, we do not have, in my mind, any idea of how to systematically measure schools in a way that gives everybody in the public the picture they want right now, and that's a problem, right? Problem sounds negative. Maybe it's an opportunity because people value different things, they care about different things in schools. Some people care about climate more than grades. 5 years ago, I would have been like, that's crazy. Now I'm like, I don't know. Let's talk about it.
They're related, too.
School report cards are coming, so we'll see what people value in this day and age.
Yeah.
Mike Usdan, the Institute for Educational Leadership, and Rick, I won't make a speech, I promise. I'm reminded the discussion of implementation and capacity and et cetera reminds me of Walter Isaacson's wonderful saying in The Innovators, vision without implementation is hallucination. and I really think that's one of the very major lessons from the Bush-Obama years. And I guess Bethany and Mike both mentioned the capacity at implementation and so forth. The word oversight has not been mentioned, and the lack of capacity of any governmental entity at any level to exercise oversight, I think, is an important point here. But is there an opportunity now with what Mike Kirst is doing in California with the bottom-up, moving from a very centralized to an extraordinarily decentralized system? And I think the reality that we've all learned, and my gray hair indicates that I've survived waves of educational reform. I even remember when the original ESEA in 1965 was called the Railroad Act because it was public law, I don't know, whatever, Lyndon Johnson just rammed it through. So in any event, we have an opportunity now where one of the things we've learned is that change in this fragmented, decentralized system is top-down, it's bottom-up, it's diagonal, and maybe there's an opportunity now to kind of not go to utter decentralization and fragmentation, but of course the failures of the top-down that you people have elaborated on. But there's an opportunity here, I think. I think keep an eye on California. You know, Kirst is not sure it's going to work, but he's convinced that the top-down didn't work.
Yeah, look, I would just put in, I would put in a plug. There's a great chapter in the book. Sarah Dayhill Brown devotes an entire chapter to state capacity and the lessons that were learned about both how state capacity wasn't developed, how it could be developed, and others. So I think she has some really great insights related to that.
Hi, my name is Peter Murphy. I'm with the Invest in Education Foundation in New York. And I have to just put a plug in for Race to the Top for all of its flaws or lack of fulfillment. One very, very tangible positive that came out of it, from at least in my state, and I think quite a few others, but we were very involved in New York's effort to raise the charter school cap. And the beauty of that was that we used a spokesperson like President Obama to shame the very anti-charter school state assembly, Democratic state assembly, to pit them against each other. And the money he was promising, and also the lack of prescription by the feds on what a charter school should be to get the money. I think that was hugely important. They were not they were not prescriptive about what a state charter school had to be, just raise the cap. And absent that, push in Race to the Top never would have happened in New York. There would be tens of thousands of kids. We would be stuck at a lower number today. There would be lots of kids without this opportunity in the state of New York. So that's a very tangible achievement of this law. And
I think an important point
I just wanted to mention.
No, but an important point is in there as well. Pat McGuinn of Drew University, New Jersey, has a great chapter on incentives and inducements. But one of the lessons he had out of that I think is related to that is when we're thinking about lessons learned around how these incentives and inducements can work, the types of activities that they are trying to incent matter. So doing things like lifting a charter cap, which, as you said, we're not talking about what a charter school is supposed to look like, or we're just saying you need to lift this cap. Removing the firewall between like a student records and teacher records. Those types of clear, straightforward, anybody from a mile away can tell whether or not they've happened or not. Those are the types of things that I think federal inducements can do well. It's when you need to change how you're evaluating the hundreds of thousands of teachers in your state. That's where stuff starts to go off the rails, just because it's so much more challenging, so much more nuanced, and also to do it at the speed that we want you to, and all of those. So I think that's an important lesson that's tied in there.
And what's useful there to keep in mind is if you do the breakdown of the 19 priorities of Race to the Top across the 500 points, what's pretty clear is about 100 of the points were for these kinds of clear removal activities, charter caps, data firewalls. About 400 over about 15 or 16 priorities were very, very other different kinds of activity. So partly what happens, and this is part of where these debates can obscure more than they elucidate, is people will talk about the parts of the elephant that are useful. And so the reality, I think what Mike and I try to talk about is Race to the Top, for instance, as a model, parts of it were well conceived, given what Washington can do. Parts of it were horribly conceived. And then the other part of it, the price you have to keep in mind. So if you're thinking about this, if you're in New York or Chicago or California, being able to bring Obama to bear on these debates was a hugely powerful lever. On the other hand, in lots of red states across the country, having Obama become the spokesperson for other parts of Race to the Top, like Common Core and the assessments, actually created a huge drag that I don't think they appreciated at the time, but that later on. And so partly these calculations, it's easy to make them post hoc, and I don't think Mike and I are like really interested in relitigating stuff from 8 or 10 years ago. But as the as DeVos and the Trump administration think about it, as the Cory Booker administration or whatever tackles these things, we think there actually are things that make it much more likely your ideas are going to have a fighting chance to do what you want to do for kids, and it would be nice if we're trying to apply those lessons other than after the fact.
Hi, I'm Matt. I work at Teach for America. Hello. I'm curious to know the lessons that you guys have been discussing and put it in a forward-facing context for higher education reauthorization, which you've touched upon a little bit. And I'm actually less interested maybe in the Title II teacher evaluation pipeline stuff, and maybe more interested in the bigger picture, Title IV, that kind of thing, because I'm trying to get my head around about what these lessons might look like in the next 2 or 3 years.
So Rick's looking at me because we just finished a project together in this area, and I do a lot of higher ed work. No, it's just I think about this particular question all the time, and in reading the book, I had a lot of reflection on how not to overreach, as tempting as it is, because it's really tempting. And I think in higher education, we are inching towards a reform agenda in higher education that's desperately needed. And the question of, how do you work carefully on the issue I brought up earlier of having leverage that is oddly thin in many ways, and that would, second you put your thumb on it, everybody does everything badly that you don't want them to. So, you want to hold institutions of higher education responsible for not having three-quarters of their students drop out, but then everyone says the first thing they'll do is stop accepting students who have less likelihood of graduating, and you'll restrict access. So really trying to think about how you weigh in. One of my biggest lessons learned that I mentioned capacity earlier really is when you tell people that they have to do something and they don't know how, they'll do whatever they do know how to do, which often is a terrible choice. And so the reading worksheets is a great example of this. The federal government didn't tell you exactly how you had to actually improve student achievement. It just said, hey, there's an expectation that not all of your students, well, certainly not all of your black and brown students can fail. We need to do something about that problem. How you did that, there are a million choices institutions could have made, schools could have made, states could have made, districts could have made. It was not prescriptive. But the answer was they didn't know how to fix the problem, or they didn't have the political will to do the harder things they would have had to do to fix the problem. And so they did really bad things in a lot of cases. I think we have to keep that in mind in the higher ed context too, is how are you light enough in the touch of whatever reform or accountability agenda you move towards that you don't over-rotate in ways that will drive bad consequences.
Or they didn't have the resources to do what they needed to do. I just wanted to
Yes, the capacity piece, absolutely.
Yeah, I sort of.
Well, while we were sitting here, the secretary approved her very last state ESSA plan.
Wow.
Now everyone is free to go forth and prosper.
We were able to share this moment
breaking
together.
news. We experience history today.
And I think the rest of the week is going to really focus on education in this town, too.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure I have so many stories that people will totally be interested in.
Wait, can I just add just one small thing?
Wrap up
it
thought.
up, Daisha,
Wrap up thought.
Okay, so just the last thing on this. So with the school intervention stuff under NCLB, I think there's there's an important lesson there. So there were 7 things you could do if you were in year 5 or later of not meeting AYP. And everyone did the first one, which was to sit around, be miserable about it, and keep doing what you were doing, right? Which also was the one that required the least change. And I really don't know how you manage the tension of knowing people need to do something different, giving them optionality about what they do, and knowing they're going to choose the thing that is least disruptive, even if it is the least effective. That's not an answer, but I saw that, writ large, very high relief during NCLB, and I think higher ed could probably reflect the same thing, and you got to look out for that. So.
Thank you guys so very much. Can we please give our panel a round of applause? Thanks so much for joining us. You can, if you want to relive this magical moment, you can rewatch it.
And
And everyone have a good evening.